Under the cold glare of the United Nations lights, a young African president stood still, his face calm, his hands steady, his silence heavier than the speeches that came before him. Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old leader of Burkina Faso, had been handed a script. 12 pages long, 12 missing signatures. One condition, read this: stay silent. Keep the aid flowing. The world expected obedience. Cameras were ready. Diplomats leaned forward. For Washington and Paris, it was supposed to be a routine performance, a symbolic submission wrapped in diplomacy. But what happened next broke every rule of global politics. Traoré folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and looked straight into the cameras. His first words cut through decades of silence. "I was not sent here to repeat someone else's script." In that instant, the entire hall froze. The air changed. You could almost feel 4 centuries of debt colonization and quiet humiliation beginning to crack. It was no longer just a speech, it was rebellion in a suit. And 43 African nations felt the tremor. Outside in the heart of Ouagadougou, more than 50,000 people gathered in Revolution Square, holding torches waiting for the broadcast that would define a generation. Across the Atlantic, analysts whispered, has Africa finally found its voice? Because this wasn't simply about one man refusing to read a statement. It was about dignity refusing to be dictated. It was about the courage to stand when the world demands you kneel. So tonight, as we revisit that day, the day of forbidden speech turned into a continental awakening, ask yourself, when you refuse to kneel before power, do you rise? Or do you stand alone? Stay with us. Because what began as a defiance at the UN would soon challenge not just the International Monetary Fund, not just the West, but the entire order of the modern world. Please share if you believe dignity should never come with conditions. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines. 2 months before that thunderous day in New York, the stage had already been set not in the spotlight of the United Nations, but in the shadows of quiet diplomacy. It began with a phone call that never came. Then another, aid transfers delayed, meetings postponed. Western partners who once praised Burkina Faso's reforms suddenly turned silent. After openly condemning the bombing of Gaza and denouncing France's interference in the Sahel, Ibrahim Traoré had crossed an invisible line. Washington and Paris agreed on one thing: he had to be contained. The message arrived not as a threat, but as a document 12 pages long drafted in Washington, refined in Paris. A bureaucratic dagger disguised as a peace offering. Read this, the letter said, and your $450 million in IMF relief will be safe. Refuse, and Burkina Faso will face financial isolation. Inside those 12 pages was not diplomacy. It was surrender. A forced apology to the West written in the name of stability. The IMF called it a statement of alignment. Traoré called it a script of submission. Late one night in Ouagadougou, the American ambassador arrived at the presidential residence. On the table lay leaked documents showing Burkina Faso's new gold contracts with China, proof that Traoré was shifting away from Western economic control. The ambassador's tone was polite, his words sharp. We know everything, he said quietly. That means we can do anything. For most leaders, that would have been enough to bend the knee. But Traoré didn't flinch. He studied the ambassador for a moment, then smiled. The next day, his communications office quietly leaked a rumor to Western media the president would issue a formal apology at the UN. Diplomats exhaled in relief. Investors relaxed. In Washington, officials called it a positive sign. In Paris, newspapers ran the headline, Traoré returns to the fold. But 3,000 miles away in Burkina Faso's Revolution Square, a different story was unfolding. By the end of that week, more than 50,000 citizens had gathered beneath the bronze statue of Thomas Sankara, holding torches and hand-painted banners that read, "We do not kneel." They weren't waiting for an apology, they were waiting for a miracle. Mothers brought their children. Old soldiers came in uniform. Musicians played drums that echoed through the capital. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of faith, defiance, and fear. Everyone knew that the president was walking into a global trap, but they also knew he had no intention of bowing. In the days leading up to the UN session, diplomats tried to reason with him. The speech must be moderate, one EU envoy warned. The markets are watching. Yet Traoré's only response was a calm, almost prophetic remark. If truth threatens the markets, then it's not truth that must change, it's the markets. And so on the morning of his departure to New York, Traoré walked through the crowd that had gathered outside the airport. He didn't wave or smile. He simply raised his right hand clenched in a fist, and the crowd answered with a single chant that rolled like thunder across the tarmac. No apology. No apology. When his plane took off, the air in Ouagadougou vibrated with something ancient, the sound of a people who had chosen pride over pity. Farmers paused in their fields to listen to the radio. Students stayed up through the night waiting for his address. In the presidential press room, advisors debated whether he should improvise or stick to his talking points. He dismissed them gently. If I read what they wrote, I lose my country. If I speak from my soul, maybe I lose my life, but at least I will die free. By the time his convoy reached the UN building in New York, the story was already alive across Africa. Hashtags flooded social media. Yada no apology. Africa, Ibrahim Traoré, yada dignity, has no price. News anchors speculated about what he might say. Diplomats whispered about damage control, but no one, not even his closest allies, knew exactly what would happen once he stood before the world. And that is where history paused. The moment before the storm. A young president, a folded piece of paper in his pocket, and a continent holding its breath. Because what was supposed to be a scripted confession was about to become a declaration of independence not for one country, but for an entire people long silenced by power. The hall was still that heavy, suffocating kind of silence that only comes before history. Every camera focused on him. Every diplomat poised their pen above their notepad. They all expected surrender. After all, the script was ready, printed, and waiting. But when Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to the podium, there was no paper in his hands, no teleprompter, no sign of hesitation. Only a young man from a small, landlocked African nation standing beneath the world's most powerful flag. He took a slow breath, looked up at the assembly, and asked the question that froze time itself. Before you ask me to apologize, have you ever apologized to Africa? The translators in their booth stopped mid-sentence. Journalists lifted their heads. Delegates turned to one another in disbelief. In that single moment, the balance of the room shifted. The performance they expected had turned into judgment, and they were the ones on trial. Then Traoré began. His tone was calm, deliberate, almost surgical, but his words cut like steel. For 3 unbroken hours without a single written line, he dismantled decades of polite hypocrisy. He spoke of the gold taken from African soil without repayment. He listed the loans disguised as chains. He named the wars fought in the name of peace and the aid that arrived only with signatures of obedience. You call it assistance, he said, but every dollar comes with a leash. You call it democracy, but every election comes with a script. We are told to speak freely as long as we repeat your words. The hall shifted uncomfortably. Some delegates whispered. Others looked down, pretending to read notes that weren't there. Only a few, mostly from the global south, nodded in silent recognition. Outside, in Ouagadougou's Revolution Square, the speech was broadcast live. The crowd erupted each time his voice rose. Women, ululated drums thundered, and the phrase, "We will not apologize," rolled like a wave across the capital. It was no longer a political act, it was spiritual liberation. By the second hour, Traoré's tone changed. He spoke not of anger, but of healing. He reminded the world that Africa's wealth, its gold, its oil, its people, had built the prosperity of others for centuries. He did not demand pity, he demanded parity. We do not seek revenge, he declared. We seek respect. We are not asking to be saved. We are asking to be seen. In those words, a generation heard its reflection. Students in Nairobi paused their studies to stream the speech. Taxi drivers in Lagos turned up their radios. In Accra Street, vendors stopped to listen. By the third hour, the hall was no longer quiet, it was trembling. Some Western diplomats quietly left the room. Others stayed, faces, pale hands clasped. When the speech finally ended, there was a pause, long, uneasy, almost holy. Then a hesitant ripple of applause scattered at first, then growing louder, spreading across the assembly like thunder breaking a storm. But the true explosion came thousands of miles away. In Africa's cities, cheers erupted. Fireworks lit the sky above Ouagadougou. In Dakar, students sang in the streets. In Ghana, musicians began composing what would become the anthem of a movement, No Apology. That night, 43 African ambassadors met in secret inside the UN building. By midnight, they emerged with a signed declaration, the New York Declaration, a 12-point manifesto rejecting conditional aid and demanding a new era of sovereignty-driven cooperation. Its first line was simple: dignity is not negotiable. By dawn, the document had reached every capital on the continent. Addis Ababa confirmed that the African Union would convene an emergency session. Kenya, Senegal, and Tanzania publicly endorsed Traore's call for reform. In the West, however, panic set in. The European Union suspended $27 million in aid. The IMF delayed its debt review. French newspapers screamed populism in Africa. Yet behind closed doors, even Western analysts admitted something irreversible had begun. They called it the Traore effect. In just 3 hours, a single man had turned a forced apology into a declaration of freedom. What began as one voice at the United Nations had become a continental awakening, a reminder that the era of dictated sovereignty was ending. And as dawn broke over Africa, a quiet truth settled over the world. When a nation finds its dignity, it cannot be colonized again, not by armies, not by debt, and not by silence. When Ibrahim Traoré walked out of the United Nations building that evening, the applause had faded, but the aftershocks had only begun. What he left behind was not just a speech, it was a political earthquake that began rewriting Africa's relationship with the world. Within hours, the ripple spread. In Addis Ababa, the African Union held an emergency night session. Delegates from 43 nations gathered to discuss what the media would soon call the New York Declaration. The outcome was extraordinary, a 12-point document signed by 12 heads of state affirming one shared truth: no more aid tied to obedience. We will accept partnership, not paternalism, the document read. Dignity cannot be traded for loans, nor sovereignty for debt relief. By dawn, embassies across the continent began reviewing their cooperation agreements. Ministries in Mali, Ghana, and Niger quietly postponed IMF consultations. In Senegal, Parliament debated a motion to audit every Western aid program since 2000. Even Kenya's youth movement, long critical of government dependency, adopted Traore's phrase, "Freedom has no sponsor." Meanwhile, across African streets and digital spaces, something far greater than diplomacy was awakening. Social media exploded with a single phrase, "Jacques, no apology." Africa. It began as a poem performed outside Nairobi University. We are not sorry for being black. We are not sorry for being free. Within days, it had become a continental chorus. Musicians in Ghana turned it into an anthem. Artists painted murals of Traoré alongside Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba. Women's cooperatives in Senegal held candlelight vigils calling him the voice we were waiting for. The spirit of rebellion had turned into culture, art, rhythm, memory. But with inspiration came consequences. The backlash from the West was swift and calculated. The European Union froze $27 million in development aid. The IMF delayed Burkina Faso's debt review, citing macroeconomic instability. France launched a media campaign portraying Traoré as an extremist, warning investors to avoid political risk. Yet, in a paradox that few economists could explain, those very sanctions ignited an unexpected economic surge. Local investors converted their assets into national bonds. Small businesses printed signs reading, "Funded without France." Domestic gold sales rose by 22%, and rural cooperatives began exporting directly to regional markets. They tried to isolate us, Traoré said later, but isolation only revealed who truly stood with us. Within 3 months, Burkina Faso recorded its highest rate of domestic investment in over a decade. The young president's approval rating surpassed 80%. Even opposition figures once divided began to rally around a new slogan: sovereignty is survival. Politically, the landscape of Africa shifted. Leaders in Mali and Niger announced plans for a joint sovereign fund to manage gold and energy revenues. Ghana's finance minister proposed an African exchange index to price commodities in local currencies. And in Addis Ababa, the African Union formally adopted a resolution to reduce foreign aid dependency by 40% within 5 years. In a single season, what began as a banned speech had turned into a structural awakening and assertion of collective self-worth. For decades, Africa's destiny had been negotiated in foreign capitals. Now, for the first time in modern history, its future was being debated in African streets, classrooms, and parliaments. Burkina Faso had spoken, and the continent had listened. In Washington, the reaction was not disbelief, it was concern. Internal memos leaked from the State Department described Traoré's defiance as a destabilizing precedent. The language was careful, bureaucratic, but the meaning was unmistakable. If one African leader could reject the IMF's script and survive, others might follow. Behind closed doors, U.S. intelligence analysts warned that the Traoré doctrine could reshape global influence in the global south. In one confidential report, a senior diplomat wrote, "What we are witnessing is not populism, it's a moral realignment. The West may no longer be the referee of democracy, but just another player on the field." At the White House, advisors debated how to respond. Some argued for diplomacy, others for quiet containment. Washington did not want to appear colonial, but neither could it allow a young African president to inspire 43 nations to question the foundations of the world's financial order. France, on the other hand, moved from panic to fury. Parisian tabloids accused Traoré of aligning with Moscow. Television pundits called him Africa's Che Guevara. Yet even among critics there was a grudging respect for his audacity. One French journalist admitted live on air, "We may disagree with him, but no French leader today could speak with that kind of conviction." Across Europe, governments scrambled to contain what analysts called the ideological contagion. Britain's Financial Times warned that a century of European influence in Africa could unravel faster than anyone imagined. Meanwhile, Russia and China saw opportunity where the West saw rebellion. Moscow immediately announced new scholarships for African students and offered satellite communication equipment to the Sahel Alliance. Beijing proposed renewable energy and mining infrastructure projects worth hundreds of millions under its Belt and Road Initiative. Even Iran joined the wave, pledging $150 million in agricultural cooperation to strengthen food sovereignty. For Washington, this was the nightmare scenario, a geopolitical realignment fueled not by military coups, but by ideas, a soft rebellion powered by dignity. In the United States, the public reaction was mixed. Some media outlets framed Traoré as a radical anti-Western nationalist, but others, especially independent commentators and members of the African American community, saw him as a mirror of lost moral courage. At Howard University, professors held a symposium titled "The New Voice of the Global South." Civil rights groups compared Traoré's words to those of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. In churches across Atlanta and Chicago, pastors spoke about Africa reclaiming its soul. Even in Latin America and the Caribbean, murals of Traoré began appearing beside those of Che Guevara and Toussaint Louverture. From Havana to São Paulo, a phrase spread across student banners: "No apology for freedom." In universities across Europe, debates erupted around a new term, moral debt. Students asked whether former colonial powers owed not just money, but truth and honest acknowledgement of centuries of exploitation. The Western establishment, long accustomed to speaking for Africa, now found itself having to speak to Africa and to listen. What began as a single act of defiance at the UN had become a mirror for the entire world. For the first time, leaders in Washington, Paris, and Brussels were forced to ask themselves a question Africa had asked for generations: who truly owns the meaning of freedom, the one who gives aid or the one who refuses to beg for it? And as this question echoed through parliaments, boardrooms, and newsrooms alike, one thing became clear: the balance of moral power was shifting. The world was no longer defined by who had the money, but by who had the courage to say no. When the lights of New York faded and the cameras stopped rolling, Ibrahim Traoré returned to a quieter battlefield, the one inside every nation's conscience. The applause had ended, but the question remained: can dignity survive in a world built on dependency? In Ouagadougou, the night after his speech, a soft rain fell over Revolution Square. The crowds had gone home, the torches extinguished, but one old war veteran stayed behind. His hands trembled as he approached the young president and offered a folded piece of cloth, the first independence flag of Burkina Faso. Its colors were faded, its edges torn, yet its message was eternal. Sewn into the fabric were 12 words that had outlasted every empire: dignity has no price. That quiet gesture captured everything Traoré's rebellion stood for. It was not about power. It was about memory, about the unbroken line between those who fought with rifles in 1960 and those who now fight with ideas in 2025. And as Traoré held that flag, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence said it all, a silence that carried through the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, across the markets of Nairobi, the classrooms of Accra, and even into the offices of Washington and Brussels. Because this story is no longer about one man or one country. It's about us, about every citizen, every leader, every nation that has ever chosen comfort over courage or traded truth for approval. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide that silence is no longer an option. Freedom. Traore once said, is not a gift to be received. It is a responsibility to be lived, and that is the heart of it. In the 21st century, the world doesn't need more speeches, it needs more conviction. The kind that dares to stand alone if standing alone means standing for what's right. So tonight, wherever you are in America, in Africa, in Europe, ask yourself, what is the one thing in your life or in your nation that must never be apologized for? If this story moved, you don't let it fade. Share it. Comment your thoughts. Join the conversation. Because every act of awareness, every voice that refuses to kneel, is part of the same revolution Traore began. History, after all, is written by those who refuse to bow. Will you be one of them?